two smartphones, both alike in form factor. In fair Australia, where we set our scene. No, wait. I don't think this quite calls for the bard. But it is kind of interesting that about a week before the Pixel 9 Pro Fold showed up in my test bench, Samsung's very similar Galaxy Z Fold 6 finally showed up to be tested. They're both very, very similar phones. They're both foldables. They're both serving that high-cost, I want a small tablet style market. But which one should you buy? Well, I've been testing them out, and I have full written reviews. I have descriptions in the link below if you want to go and read those and get a more detailed insight. But this really did feel like a situation where a head-to-head was called for. So let's get into it. So on the subject of cost, I want to get this one out of the way really, really quickly because these are both super expensive phones. I should point out, by the way, that the Pixel Fold was never actually released in Australia. So the Pixel 9 Pro Fold is the first of Google's foldables that we've seen down under, officially speaking. But Samsung put its pricing up for its Fold this year, and it's not as though the Pixel is super cheap. Yes, it is technically less expensive, but you're still spending north of $2,500 on these phones, and if that doesn't send you into sticker shock, then I don't really think that the price differences between these are going to be a really primary factor as to which one you choose. So having tested both phones pretty extensively over the past couple of weeks, it's interesting to see where these phones are essentially the same and where they differ and what that means for utility in terms of design. So both of them use the same kind of essential aesthetic. You're talking a book, basically. A cover display of some sort which opens up into a larger, small tablet-style display. Both of them use side-mounted fingerprint scanners, which both work about as well as each other, honestly. And both of them throw cameras on basically every side of the phone that you might choose to use, although I'll get into that in a little bit when I talk about the camera quality. However, they are very different phones in the hand. Let's start with the Pixel 9 Pro Fold, which from the front very much has the look of a standard phone. I mean, honestly, you drop something like the Pixel 9 or the Pixel 9 Pro on top of this, and the only way you pick the difference is the side hinge creating a bezel on the left-hand side. This is a full-screen phone, and that design does bring with it some benefits that you don't see with the Samsung. And that's because while technically both of them have 6.3-inch displays, the Samsung's taller and thinner display is just less satisfying. I mean, it's lower resolution for a start, but also I find when I'm using it, if I'm using the Pixel, I can just use that like a regular Android phone because it is a regular Android phone when it's folded up. It's a 6.3-inch phone. It acts pretty much identically to any other 6.3-inch phone. Where the Samsung is thinner, there's less text on screen. I find myself wanting to open the Samsung up in circumstances where I feel like I don't need to open the Pixel up. So there's a definite advantage to the Pixel there, and it's one that extends when you open both of them up too, because the size difference is considerable and it does have an impact on how you use them. Whether you're running apps side by side, or whether you just want a full screen app because you want lots of text or you want lots of social media doom scrolling, I'm not going to judge. Android's gotten a little bit better at this kind of larger screen stuff over the years. Not every app plays nice on either phone, to be honest. But the ones that do, the larger screen on the Pixel really does have an impact. In design terms, it's an interesting one. Some people genuinely will prefer the slightly more business-like aesthetic of the Samsung, those sharper corners, and the choice of colours is nice. You only get 2 with the Pixel where you get 4 with the Samsung. Conversely, some may prefer the rounded corners of the Pixel. The Samsung is slightly more durable at IP48 versus IPX8, so while both should survive immersion in water, it's not a great idea. Don't just go drowning phones, people. Only the Samsung has been lab tested against the ingress of small objects. This is not, a sand-proof or dust-proof phone, and proof is a whole different bag of worms, but this is a phone that has been tested against the ingress of small screws and small insects and things like that. Google is not certifying in that same way, and I'd be careful with both phones. I should point out, by the way, the Pixel is technically thinner than the Samsung is. Honestly, during my testing, that's been barely noticeable because, and I think a lot of my viewers are going to know it's coming, I threw a phone case on it anyway. I'd throw phone cases on these so fast it would make your head spin. Now I put cases on everything. But when you're spending north of $2,500 on a phone, not putting a case on it just feels insane to me. So who takes the victory in the design stacks? Look, I've got to give it to the Pixel here. I think if you're going for that phone that is larger because it folds out into a tablet, then getting the phone that is definitely larger, and larger in ways that aid utility, makes a whole lot of sense. What about on the camera front? Well, this one's pretty neck and neck in my testing, I've got to be honest, but I've also got to put forth my gripe about both of these phones, and this really bugs me, because these are the most expensive phones that Samsung and Google make respectively. It's not even particularly close, but they don't have the best cameras that Samsung or Google put into a phone. If you want the best Samsung camera phone, currently that's the Galaxy S24 Ultra, no question. If you want the best Google camera phone, that's either the Pixel 9 Pro XL or the Pixel 9 Pro, because they've got the same camera modules. And all of those phones are cheaper than either of these. And I just don't get that. I figure if you're spending that much, Samsung and Google should be giving us the best cameras, and they're not. And I do recognise that there are challenges with the folding form factor and what you can fit in and so on. I would happily put up with a slightly thicker phone to have the best cameras available if I'm spending this kind of money. That aside, there are some interesting balancing games. Look, neither of these are bad camera phones. They're not. They're absolutely not. They can produce some really pretty good photos. Again, I feel like they should be great cameras, but I'm getting back onto that point again. The Samsung maybe has this weird edge if you want really long zoom, because it'll go up to 30 times where the Pixel will only go up to 20. But the Pixel has native 5 times optical telephoto, which I feel like you're going to use more, because those long zooms, without a tripod especially, often produce pretty lousy photos. Both are reasonable in low light without being exceptional again. The Samsung does have a very slight advantage if you're using it close, simply because it's thinner. Here's one area where its design actually gives it a small win. I will maintain to my dying day that taking photos in a tablet mode or with a tablet is a lousy experience. It's hard to hold and frame and sort and use. So most of the time when I'm taking photos with these, it's when they're closed. The Samsung is a little easier to hold, therefore it's a little easier to use. Of course, your experience may differ there. But ultimately, on the camera front, I'm going to call this one a draw. They're both pretty good, but they're not the best you can get. It's performance time. Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 for Galaxy versus Tensor G4. 2 processors enter the Thunderdome, and one emerges while the other is left as a pile of broken teeth and pink mist. And this isn't even a battle that takes that long to conclude, because it isn't really a battle at all. And I think most people know that this is coming, because Google's Tensor processors have lagged behind in performance terms for years now, and the G4 is no different. I mean, here's the benchmarks to kind of show how these phones compare, even how they compare against older Samsung Galaxy Fold phones. And yeah, it's just not even close. The Samsung just takes this by a mile. Now, that's not to say that the Pixel is a slow phone. It isn't. Modern flagships are fast phones, period. And most of them are more than equal to the current state of the art in Android apps. Multitasking maybe makes that a little bit different. And of course, with these phones opened up, you're more likely to want to multitask. The 16 gig of RAM on the Pixel might give it a slight edge, but honestly, with 12 gig, the Samsung is no slouch. Google's contention, of course, is that Tensor G4 is really finely tuned for AI. And there I've got to say, if AI is really important to you, yes, the Pixel is the phone to buy. Google's clearly more all in on AI. You get Gemini Advanced for a year with the Pixel. There's a lot more advantages there, and there seems to be a lot more investment there than on the Samsung side of things. I will say that I feel like the jury is still very much out as to whether or not consumers want that kind of thing, and especially whether or not they'll pay for it, because Gemini Advance is only covered for that first year, after which it's $32.99 a month to use the thing. Doesn't set my world on fire, and the various AI photo generation features that both phones have actually don't really excite me. They do feel more gimmicky than actually useful for the most part. The Pixel also scores with me for being millimeter wave, and this is after Google dropped millimeter wave on the Pixel 9 Pro phones here in Australia. It's curious. They said to a room full of journalists that the market didn't need millimeter wave, but this has millimeter wave. I like that, and the Samsung just doesn't have it, but it's a much more minor factor. Where I think the power story is more interesting, though, and where the Samsung, I think, does take the real lead, is in long-term durability. And this depends on how long you want to keep the phone for. If you're only talking about a 2 to 3 year cycle, yeah, that's probably not going to matter so much. But both of these phones come with the promise of 7 years of OS upgrades. And curiously, the Pixel 9 Pro Fold has launched with Android 14, not 15. So we should see these both finish out Android upgrades at the same time. But by the time we get there, 7 years in the future, this is still going to be a much faster phone, and I suspect more capable of running the Android apps we've got then, of dealing with whatever the Android OS stuff gets then. The Pixel gets Pixel feature drops, but I suspect it will drop off the feature drop list, or it will drop some of those newer Pixel features because of the power of Tensor G4. Samsung doesn't tend to add so many new features to the older phones, but having more power here means this will stay a fresh and fast and current phone a lot longer, and I think that does give the Samsung more value. So the win here is very easily Samsung's. On paper, the Pixel 9 Pro Fold has a battery edge over the Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 6, with a slightly large battery, but that's really mathematical, much more than actual. But the issue here, as I've seen with hundreds of phones over many, many years, is that battery size is not the be-all and end-all. I've seen plenty of phones with big batteries that have terrible, terrible battery life. So these needed to be tested. And first of all, I turned to my standard YouTube battery test. So that's a 1 hour 1080p video playback session, maximum brightness, moderate volume from a full battery to see how much they'd run down. So let's have a look at how these two phones compare head-to-head in that test. That's not very useful, is it? I mean, it's really good. Those are good figures for these phones, and they're basically the same whether they're open or shut, which is really pleasing to see. But that then turns to anecdotal usage, and anecdotally, yeah, actually, they're very much the same as well. All-day battery life is very much a thing you can get from these. Now, I could call that a moral victory for the Samsung, partially because prior Fold phones had much worse battery life, and this is a definite improvement. And partially, of course, because it is running that much more powerful Snapdragon processor compared to the Tensor G4. But in day-to-day usage, what you really care about is my phone going flat? The answer is no. Neither of these phones are going flat any appreciably faster than the other. The charging story is much the same on both of them, with USB-C charging, no charger in the box for either, or wireless. I am a little bit annoyed that it's not Qi 2, especially because placing these phones onto wireless chargers can be a little bit tricky. I should note, weirdly, that the Pixel 9 Pro Fold does not work with Google's own Pixel stand. So if I drop, a Pixel 9 onto the Pixel stand, yep, happy as. If I drop the Pixel 9 Pro Fold, it doesn't even recognize it. Clearly, the magnetic coils are in the wrong place. Interesting choice there, Google. Interesting choice. But otherwise, look, no, this is an absolute draw in battery terms. They're both pretty good battery performers. End of story. So which one should you choose? Well, look, obviously you've got to get past that sticker price problem to start with. If you cannot stomach the cost of these phones, and that's fine and that's totally understandable, and the question about whether or not they're good value is a different one, then these are not going to be for you. But your choice, I think, comes down to one between size mattering the most to you or power. Now, in this space, and I've long described myself as a fold guy, I like this form factor just that bit more than the flips. In this space, having more size matters a lot, I think, because what you're buying is a phone that can become a much bigger phone, and that's got some big pluses. And if that's you, if that's what you treasure, then the Pixel 9 Pro Fold is the phone you should buy. It's bigger, it has more utility as a result of being bigger than the Samsung does. However, If you want a foldable phone that becomes a larger phone that has more processing power, that is absolutely the Samsung, and it is not even close. That's ultimately the choice you've got to make. So which choice would you make? I lean, I've got to be honest, at the end of the day, slightly more towards the Pixel, just because I do like that larger form factor, but I can't ignore the power side of the Samsung either. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching.